Marawichanga, Gana Miana no Wangani, Mani the Budni Gani Adana. Naibiriko, Mankalakala, Tandanya, Mianaku. Nature Yungandalia, Nature Yakalandalia, Padni Adlu Wadu. On behalf of the Ghana people, I welcome you all to Ghana country, and I do this ambassador of the Adelaide Plains people. My brothers, my sisters, let's walk together in harmony. Natalia.
Thanks very much, Uncle Lewis, much appreciated. Now my pleasure to introduce Rob Amery, Head of Linguistics in the University School of Humanities. His research appropriately focuses on endangered languages, and I'm interested to read that Rob started working with Aboriginal communities back in 1980 in the area of health, firstly as a nurse, then as an Aboriginal health worker. But for 25 years he's been working on Australian Aboriginal languages, specifically the reclamation and reintroduction of the Kaurna language of the Adelaide Plains. So he was recognised for his work in 2007 with a UNESCO Certificate of Achievement. Congratulations for that, Rob, and we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Katalia. Mani Nabudni. Mani Ngadlo Tampandi, Ngadlo Gana Yatanga in Berindi. Gana Miana, Yaicha Matanya, Wama Tandanyaku. It's good that we acknowledge that we're meeting together on Ghana land. Ghana people are the Indigenous owners, custodians of the Adelaide Plains. Now, I've got to apologise in advance for my voice this evening. It's a little bit better than it was last week, but still not what it should be. I've got a lot of slides here, so I'm going to have to stick to a script. I won't be able to go through everything on the slides, but if you want them, I'm happy to share them later. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you in this, the United Nations International Year of Indigenous Languages, 2019. To talk about the Ghana language movement. That's our journey, which has been going on for the last 3 decades now. 1989 is when I first began work in this area. Now, the Australian Mint has made an important gesture towards the International Year of Indigenous Languages this year. A few weeks ago, a month ago, they just released this new 50-cent coin with words for coin or money from 14 Australian languages, only 14 out of 250 or so. But still, Ghana got a Guernsey there, the very last one, Pirri. Pirri meaning peace, and the word we use these days for coin. Well, Kaurna is the language of the Adelaide Plains, of Adelaide and the Adelaide Plains, and as such, it bore the brunt of colonisation and was probably the first language in this state to be lost, to be silenced. Now, colonisation, as we know, took place in 1836. Even as early as 1845, people were saying that the Kaurna people were extinct. Well, the Adelaide tribe is how they described people in those days, were extinct. Now, that's only 9 years after colonisation. Well, of course, the Kaurna people were not extinct, but this signals the rapidity with which the population plummeted. Now, smallpox was introduced into this country long before colonisation. We see from this entry in Tykelman and Sherman that they're writing that this disease came in 10 years before, so around 1830, 1829, and the effects that it had on the people that they were working with at that time. The population plummeted as a result not only of smallpox, but influenza, typhoid, due to Tannery effluent going straight into the River Torrens. the population was reduced to a very small number, not to mention the activities of sealers and whalers. My best guess is that Kaurna ceased to be spoken as an everyday language by the early 1860s. The so-called last speaker, Pirri-Wirrkinthi here, died in 1929. The last male speaker, James Phillips, died around 1890, and Maria Welch died in 1909. So for the last 20 years, Pirri-Wirrkinthi was supposedly the last remaining speaker of the Kaurna language. Well, when I began my work with Kaurna language, it wasn't really in vogue within linguistics. And in fact, my former teacher of linguistics, Professor R.M.W. Dixon, from ANU in those days, in fact, in 2001, refused to publish an introduction that I had written because I refused to acknowledge that Kaurna was as dead as Hittite, and that the attempt to resurrect Kaurna was, well, it is a political exercise, but not simply a political exercise. I must say that Dixon's views now are very much in the minority. Things really have changed within linguistics since then. The call for Kaurna language to be revived as a spoken language, however, predated me. Georgina Yumble Williams, pictured on the right here, approached SAL, the School of Australian Linguistics, up at Bachelor in the Northern Territory in the mid-1980s. Professor Nick Evans took the call, and she wanted a course in Kaurna linguistics. But then, as the only Kaurna person in a position willing to travel to Bachelor, they couldn't put on a course for one person, so it didn't happen. But the late Dr. Alicha Reawakening, who I pay immense tribute to, the first principal of Kaurna Plains School in 1986, she called for the teaching of Kaurna. She met with David Tassell, then at the Aboriginal Education Unit, sometime in the late 1980s, but before I was on the scene. I got involved in language revival work in South Australia with this Songwriters workshop in Naranga, Ngarrindjeri and Kaurna. Just 7 of the 33 songs we did back then include some Kaurna language. And significantly, this is the first creative use, the first novel sentences produced in the Kaurna language since it went to sleep. Okay, so what do we have to work with? There are more than 20 primary sources of Kaurna, but a lot of these are just short word lists which add very little to our knowledge. Most of what we know comes from the work of German missionaries. But various other sources are important too. For Pies was a surveyor, and fortunately he gave us section numbers, so we know precisely where those Kaurna names are located. Cawthorne had a particular interest in Kaurna artefacts and documented a number of words which no one else did. Wyatt did quite a bit with plants and insects and so on. But it was the Dresden Missionaries, Clement Sherman, Christian Teichelmann, who did the heavy lifting, the vast majority of documentation of the Kaurna language here. Their colleague Samuel Klose, who came out in 1840, took over the teaching of the school, whereas Meyer went to Encounter Bay to work with Wurundjeri language. Teichelmann and Sherman worked with a number of Kaurna men, and it seems they were pretty much all men rather than women. Mino Gadlit-Pina Gudnuicha, known to the colonists as Captain Jack, and described as a military genius, this man here, and Kua Mulawera Karamiru, or King John to the colonists, Uncle Pringa Jack to the colonists. We have texts recorded from these two men illustrating a dialect difference within the Kaurna language. and it's clear that they were their main sources. So what did they record? Well, we have a 24-page sketch grammar, which accords pretty well with what we know of related languages, Pama-Nyungan languages of this type, and quite a few additional grammatical notes in Tycoman manuscript, which was sent to South Africa in 1857. We've got a vocabulary of between 3,000 and 3,500 words, about 2,000 of those in Tycoman and Sherman, and then the Tycoman manuscript is an addendum to that. It complements it, needs to be read together. We've got many hundreds of phrase and sentence examples translated into English, translation of the Ten Commandments. They never got around to translating the full Bible. The population plummeted way before that. And we have Sherman's translation of Governor Gawler's speech and the translation of 6 German hymns. But the earliest known Kaurna word list was recorded by Gaimard, a Frenchman, aboard the Astrolabe on a voyage of scientific discovery. And it wasn't recorded here, it was recorded over in King George Sound, where Albany is today in Western Australia. But they knew it was from here. Vocabulaire des habitants du Golfe St. Vincent, excuse my French. And so this is a French Kaurna vocabulary with very much French-inspired spellings. Just 168 words. It doesn't add much to our knowledge of Kaurna that others didn't record, but it's fully 10 years before colonisation. Well, let's turn our attention to sounds and spelling. We don't have any sound recordings of the language as it was spoken in the 19th century. So how do we know how to pronounce the language? How do we know how to say it? Well, we can look at the ways in which various observers recorded the same word. And I've just pulled out 6 words here, and we see quite a variety of different spellings used. And that can give us some important clues. If we just took Stephen's spelling here, for instance, we'd be way astray, wouldn't we? We'd be saying something like Gula or something, when in fact it's Gadla. Way off. But if we put them all together, it gives us a better picture. But even more important is drawing comparisons with closely related languages, some of which have been recorded by trained linguists, and we have sound recordings of native speakers, and that gives us a much better way of interpreting the historical records. Well, Tycoman and Sherman, we used their spellings for a long time, but there are some problems with their record. In fact, in the Kaurna language, there are 3 different R sounds. We've got a tap, a glide, and a trill. Something like gura, gura, gura. A 3-way distinction that makes a difference in meaning. Now, Tycoman and Sherman pretty well always write the glide and the trill as a double R. You just can't tell the difference from the spelling. They mostly use a single R for the tap, but not always. Kaurna, like many Aboriginal languages, makes a distinction between interdental sounds made with the tongue between the teeth, alveolar, our regular T, and a retroflex T with the tongue curled back. And the same with the nasals and the laterals, the L sounds. But usually these sounds are not distinguished by Tycoman and Sherman in spelling. We just can't tell whether it's interdental, alveolar or retroflex. The NG in the middle of a word is a problem as well, just like it is in English. We can't tell whether that NG is like in singer or ng like in finger. We use the same spelling in English, but they're actually quite different sounds. They wrote E's and O's quite unnecessarily. They failed to distinguish between long and short vowels. So there are some problems with what they did. Well, let's take a word by way of example. The word for blood, they spelt K-A-R-R-O. Well, just looking at the spelling, there's actually 6 possibilities of how we could pronounce that word. Garu, 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 gadu, gadu. Well, how do we know which one? Well, when we look at the neighbouring language Noongar, Louise Hirkus wrote it like this, which means it's got a glide R like in English, a long vowel, so it will be garu. We'd never know from the spelling alone. It's the Noongar cognate which tells us what to do. Similarly, they wrote the word for red ochre and she oak tree exactly the same way, K-A-R-K-O. But these words are different. We know from Noongar that we've got karku, red, which is arku in Adnyamatna because it drops the K off the front. And in the black oak in Adnyamatna is alku with an L sound. And that L sound in Adnyamatna tells us that the R in she oak must be a glide R, karaku, rather than a rolled R, karaku in the word for red. So these are quite different words. The same with wirri, club, and wirri, scapula, or shoulder blade. Now, if you didn't know any more, you might be forgiven, same spelling here, that these were one and the same word. It's quite feasible that the word for scapula and club could be one and the same. But we know when we look at Noongar that they're in fact quite different words. They've got different R's, even though they were spelt the same way. If we look at Garawera-Parri, 3 lots of double R's there. The first 2 are rolled, Gara, red gum, Wera, forest, but Parri, cognate with Vari in Adnyamatna, is a glide R like in Australian English. Well, with the spelling, we persisted with Tykerman and Sherman up until 2010. But when my good mate Jack Gunya-Buckskin, who sadly couldn't make it tonight, started taking over the teaching of Kaurna, he got a bit sick and tired of having to ring me up in the middle of his class and, Rob, how do we pronounce this word? Not a good way to go. So he wanted a spelling system which tells you exactly how the word should be pronounced. And I was a bit reluctant to change the spelling myself, but I got persuaded by various people, as did Kaurna. You were a bit reluctant as well, but you got persuaded too. And so in 2010, we embraced a revised spelling system, a pretty much phonemic spelling system, where once you know the system, you know how to say the word, whether you've heard it before, whether it's familiar or not. And in some cases, the spelling is unchanged with Tykerman and Sherman. In Gunya, Rock, Ngungana, Kookaburra, Punkara territory, etc. In a few cases, there's minor differences, just an I at the end instead of an E. Excuse me. And in some cases, the words look a bit different. Haven't got time to go into all that. We'll move on to filling the gaps. Now, obviously, with only 3,500 words recorded in traditional sources, not every word got recorded. Lots of gaps. And one of those gaps was the word for echidna. Now, echidnas are still running around the Adelaide Plains. There would have been a word in the Kaurna language for it, but no one bothered to document it. So I use this by way of example. What do we do? What are the options? Well, we could simply borrow echidna, spelling it all straight from English. We could borrow echidna from English and adapt it into the Kaurna sound system. So we get something like echidna or yikidna. We could borrow the term from a neighbouring language. And fortunately, Louise Hirkus documented this word in Noongar, nala, with tongue between the teeth for both the N and the L. It could have been a Kaurna word because quite a few words are shared between Noongar and Kaurna, but we'll never know unless we find a source where it was recorded. We could use a descriptive term, and echidna is sometimes known as the spiny anteater. Well, if we translate spiny anteater, we might get something like Pitpabutu Kadni Ngarkalarkala. Bit of a mouthful. The full of thorns termite eater. Well, if we look at the Greek echidna, it is itself meaning something like full of thorns. Pitpabutu might be a reasonable equivalent. Excuse me. If we go to the Latin, well, it's a tachyglossus aculeatus. And a Tandanya wirila, a rapid tongue, probably does the job as the translation of the Latin. Or we could have other descriptive terms like a muka kaichalaichila, an egg layer, or a badu muka kaichalaichila, an animal which is an egg layer. Well, in fact, in this case, we borrowed the Nugano term, but we used the Kaurna spelling, which even though it's interdental at the beginning of the word, we just use an ordinary N. And that way it's got its own identity. It's different in its looks from Nugano, but that's where it came from. In the case of koala, well, we went back to the original Daruk, the Sydney language. Now, I don't know whether you know, but the English word koala is a corruption. Someone misread the K-O-O, misread the second O as an A when it was handwritten, and we've got a spelling pronunciation, koala. We don't want koala, we want the original, kula. For octopus, well, a Narungga word was recorded for this. Marawichi, mini hands. And so we've done a loan translation back into Kaurna. Mara's the same, Marawiti, mini hands in Kaurna. For the ibis, we've gone for Tamandinuluni, curved beak being the distinctive feature of that bird. In the case of squid and worm, well, we've borrowed them from English but assimilated them into the sound system. Well, a lot of things have changed since the 1830s, 1840s. And if we want to speak Kaurna in today's world, we really need some words for modern technologies. Now, fortunately, back in 1840, those missionaries and Williams and Wyatt and others recorded quite a few words that Kaurna people were using back then for new technologies that had been introduced by the white colonists. Nullity, keys, were literally the twisters. Biltati, scissors, were the cutting through thing. Dippagatla matches were sparked fire. A gun was pandapudi, limestone and stone, like powder and shot, I guess. We used to have muskets then, with the old ramrod. Mucky, glass, comes from ice, similar appearance. And so on. We don't have time to work through our way through all those, but we use those as the model, as the template for forming new words that we need today. So we have kandu, electricity, coming from lightning, just a semantic extension. We have compounds like mukandu, computer, from mukamuka, brain, kandu, lightning. This is also a calc, because this is what Maori do, electric brain. We have a lovely calc here in bicycle, Maichawampi. Well, I noticed that in Adnyamatna up in the Flinders Ranges, they have a word mikawiri, which is literally bat wing. Now, why would you call a bicycle a bat wing? Well, if you stretch out the wing of the bat, you've got the spokes, those thin little bones in the bat wing, like the spokes in the wheel of the bicycle. So instead of borrowing the word from Adnyamatna, we've borrowed the concept. We've translated bat wing into Kaurna, Maichawampi. We've done the same thing with helicopter. Now the Tiwi word, Bathurst Island north of Darwin, uses dragonfly for helicopter. That sounds pretty good. Did the same. Bundundu, the Kaurna word for dragonfly. Sometimes we've used reduplication. So mulla is the word for dry. Mulla mulla, the dry is towel. And I've got to credit the late Steve Gudlabati Goldsmith for this one. That was his preferred solution, and it's a wonderful one. As is the one below it, Dadlipuri, the foaming stone, which I've got to credit Uncle Lewis here for that one. I was going for something like hard oil, but you went home and thought about it, and foaming stone we have. Right, well, we've also got nappy here, the bum covering. Well, we've got didnabalta, the foot covering for shoe. Why not wanabalta, the bum covering for nappy? We've got karikaridi for plane, the thing for habitually flying in, and so on. Train, the iron centipede. Not enough time to explain all those. Well, recovery of Kaurna grammar, that's another huge area that I really don't have time to cover here. I'm sorry. You'll have to come and do my Kaurna course one summer. Let's get on to what we're really talking about here tonight, reawakening Kaurna. Well, I like to think about the 9 Fs. Family. And here's Jack Gunya Buckskin with his first daughter. He's now got 3 children, which is raising as at least semi-speakers, semi-native speakers of the Kaurna language. Their English is dominant, but they speak and understand a lot of Kaurna language. Friends. Here's Jack with his mates, is another important place to get language happening. Football. Huge big deal within the Kaurna community, huge big deal within Adelaide community as well. With footy, we need nice simple utterances. We don't need any verbal response most of the time, stands by itself. But if you're using Kaurna on the football field, it needs to be right up there, front of your brain. It needs to be very spontaneous, well rehearsed. Fishing. Another great place to introduce language. By contrast with footy, here you've got a lot of time to think about what you're going to say. A lot of time on your hands. It's a quiet environment. Again, no verbal response needed most of the time. Can lead into conversation. Really good place, something you do with your mates. Good place to introduce language. Funerals. Happens all too often within Nunga society. I guess this is, in part, testament to the strong kinship networks that still survive, but I guess it also reflects the high mortality rate within Nunga society. Anyway, we produced a book on Kaurna funeral protocols back in 2006. Here is the memorial service to the late Arpata Ali Chirigni in 2017, and we quickly formed a choir and had a few rehearsals over a couple of weeks and sang a couple of hymns at that memorial service. It was a wonderful celebration of her life. Festivals, another great place for language to be used. And film, we do quite a lot of that with the little team we've got here at Adelaide Uni. Late Stevie Gudlabati Goldsmith here, and Taylor Tipu Power Smith, who still works over there in the Schultz building, out on location there. Fun, we make a puppet show online for kids. We do some Kaurna language learning segments which have quite a lot of humour built into them. And finally, the final F, the 9th F, the formulaic method. Well, immersion, best way to learn German is to head over to Germany and put yourself in contexts where you have to speak German. Best way in the world to learn a language. But that's very difficult to do here with Kaurna. Where do you go to hear Kaurna spoken on an everyday basis? You can't turn on the television and see much Kaurna. You can't buy a newspaper. And we don't have fluent native speakers at this point in time. Well, my solution to this is to exploit code switching and to introduce well-formed chunks, well-formed utterances to use alongside English. It doesn't matter if the answer is in English, so long as the question is in Kaurna. Or if the question is in English, the answer can come back in Kaurna. It doesn't matter. So long as they're well-formed, so long as they've got grammar. When I learned a bit of German, one of the first words I learnt was Auf Wiedersehen. But no one ever explained to me that Auf Wiedersehen had 3 morphemes. Auf, so on, wieder, again, sehen, to see. We just learn it as a whole, right? Entschuldigung, excuse me, we learn it as a whole. And so we're advocating we do the same thing with Kaurna. We don't worry about the grammar initially. Down the track a bit, when people have a little bit more knowledge, well, and they start asking about the language, grammar, start asking about structure, that's the time to start explaining it. If we just move in there and start explaining grammar, it'll turn people off. All right, well, unfortunately, songs doesn't start with F. But songs are fun. They're a lot of fun. And songs are a wonderful place to start. It's much easier to sing in a language that you don't know than it is to try and speak it. Songs are a standalone product. They can be sung for their own sake. And in the situation we had back then, where we had no guaranteed funding, if we had started a regular language course, 6 months down the track, no funding, the course stops, well, where does that get you? Nowhere, really. Whereas to do some songs, they have a life of their own. They carry on. And this songbook was used again and again in so many families' hands. They were falling apart. They were really well used. Following on from that, the song theme, in the following year, we started translating some nursery rhymes at the request of childcare workers. Hickory dickory dock here, tikapi tikapi tuka, and a sailor went to sea, and various things. Now, in those days, we didn't have the electronic resources that we have today. In fact, we only had a Kaurna to English word list in Tychelman and Sherman. Well, if we wanted the word for wombat, we start reading at the beginning, and unfortunately, wombat, watu, starts with a W. You're nearly at the end of the book before you found it. Word for listen is even worse. Reawakening starts with a Y. It's on the last page. But I didn't know it was on the last page. You start at the first page and you read through, and it took us so long. We had to do that for every single word. Wouldn't have to go through that these days. Okay, let's move to the public domain. Now, the first, prior to efforts to reclaim Kaurna, it had little presence in the public domain. Just a few place names. Yankalilla, Cowandilla, Uradla, Piccadilly. No one knew they were Kaurna place names. No one knew what they meant. And people really didn't give any thought to them. Well, the first act of Kaurna naming was Reawakening Alternative School in 1980, a bit before my time. And then Welcome to Country speeches began. And Kaurna, you gave the first Welcome to Country speech on the occasion of the visit of David Suzuki. And we're not quite sure whether that was 1991 or 1989. I think you're thinking it was 89 now. 89. Anyway, back in those early years when I was doing my research for my PhD, I paid very careful attention to this. And I can be pretty sure that I got almost every speech that was ever given in those days. And we can see that it increased exponentially from one way back here, perhaps I should add 89 to this, up to 104 in the year 1997. And the number of individuals giving Kaurna speeches also increased steadily over that period. Well, since then, look, there are thousands of Welcome to Country speeches given every year. I can't keep track of them anymore. It's huge. There are thousands of instances of Kaurna naming. I've got almost 1,000 in my database, and I know there are lots and lots and lots still missing. There's lots of signage going up down there. And a few years ago, the Sisters of St. Joseph put out this plaque recognising Kaurna land, Nina Tidnama, Kaurna Miyana Mukabandu. When you tread, remember the Kaurna people. And lots of people have bought these plaques and placed them at the entrance to their home or business. We've got 3 Kaurna dance troupes, all led by Kaurna men with Kaurna names. And these dance troupes all have Kaurna names. Taikatina family, now led by Steve's son, Jamie Ngungana Goldsmith. Kumagaru, One Blood, led by Jack Gunya Buckskin. And Paicha, Deadly, led by Carl Winder Telfer. I think it's Yalaka now that Carl leads. The first work of public art was Yarrakatata, 1995, outside the Hyatt Hotel on North Terrace. And I believe, Kaurna, you had a little bit to do with this. Interestingly, on this plaque here, I'm sure you probably can't read it, but it says Gani Ata, Nata Atu Nanga, Yako Atu Bukinaki. Kaurna land before now I know it, before I didn't. Now the interesting thing is, there's no English translation down there. And I don't think it's on the web. Unless you go and learn some Kaurna, you would never know what those Kaurna words say. In fact, most of them are taken from the back of Tycoman and Sherman. Since then, there's been lots of language in public art all around the place. These plaques artworks that have gone down the Kaurna coast, down south there. Some graffiti art underneath the Southern Expressway down there at Warraparinga. It's still there. I saw it in January again. In 1996, Stevie's sister, Dot Goldsmith, now Dot Davey back then, came to me asking me to do some research about Kaurna history in the Adelaide City Council area and to put up a proposal for Kaurna naming. Now, whilst we developed the proposal in 1996 through consultation with Kaurna elders, nothing much happened for a while. It took quite some years for this to be adopted. And the final piece in the puzzle, the squares, were officially dual named in 2012. So that took 16 years for that proposal to be fully implemented. But it's happened. And from almost total obscurity, Kaurna is now widely recognised. When we asked our students back in the early 90s what the name of the language of Adelaide was, undoubtedly no student could answer that question. If we ask our students now, well over half of them know. And what I find really interesting is that more students seem to know the name Kaurna than they do the name Pidindara these days, even though Pidindara is a strong, viable language in the northwest of the state. Back in 1995, when I did a Google search for the word Kaurna, I got one hit, and that was for a word list held by IATSIS in Canberra. Now, if I do a Google search, did one the other day, 282,000 hits. And I also get thousands of hits on lots of other Kaurna words. Pankara, Karawira, Wadlipari, where there were no hits at all a few years back. Okay, well, let's move on to the private domain. Now, the private domain is probably the hardest domain of all to tackle. Whilst dying languages often survive longest within the private domain, when you're reawakening a language, when you're reviving a language, it's often the most difficult place. It's much easier to give a speech of welcome. It's much easier to put up some signage, much easier to do some emblematic language use in the public domain. The private sphere, well, we've got to change a lot of well-entrenched habits to do anything there. Kaurna people have been speaking English all their lives. They've been speaking English all their lives for several generations. And it takes a lot of willpower, a lot of effort to change that. Despite the difficulty, impressive progress has been made in the private domain, particularly by this young man, Jackanya Gudnwicha-Buckskin, who's invested a lot of great personal energy and effort in learning Kaurna language. Initially as a student of mine back in 2006, 2007 down at Pirri-Wirrkinthi, Jack would talk to his dogs here in Ghana. They only understand Ghana, don't understand English. Jack would send long emails and SMS messages to me and to his students, and he'd often leave a big gap when he sent a message to his students and then the English translation, so they were forced to grapple with it for a while. He would just go around thinking to himself what he could say in a particular situation, in a particular context, a particular place. And now that he has children, 3 lovely children, he speaks to them a lot in Ghana. And as I said before, they're at least semi-native speakers of the language. The education sector. Now, back in the early 1990s, education sector was a powerhouse for Kaurna language revival. Particularly because Alicia Reawakening, seen here, principal of Kaurna Plains School, was a shaker and mover, and she made sure that things happened. She was not only active in running Kaurna Plains School, but also on the steering committee of the National Australian Indigenous Languages Framework, on the Education Department Aboriginal Languages Standing Committee, and played a very strong advocacy role in many, many sectors. Well, here's a bit of a potted history of a few of the main things that have happened in terms of Kaurna language programs. Whilst interest from schools in wanting to introduce a Kaurna language program is very, very strong at the moment, we just can't meet the demand for Kaurna language teachers, and the delivery of Kaurna language programs has actually shrunk. There's less happening now in schools than there was a few years ago. And the kids coming out of Kaurna Plains School these days know far less Kaurna than they did back in the 1990s. Today we've got far more resources. We've got a wonderful learner's guide, we've got a lot of sound resources on the web, we've got a beautiful alphabet book, but it's just not happening in the schools. And a lot of the teachers that we had back then we're just finding very difficult to replace. Well, here's Jack Gudnwicha-Buckskin, who was very active in teaching a language in the schools about 10 years ago, before he had his children. He was teaching at Kaurna Plains School, at Adelaide High School, at Salisbury High School, Lefevre, and also in the School of Languages program down at Pirri-Wirrkinthi, running from one end of Adelaide to the other. And of course, this is another reason why his language became so proficient. If you've got to teach something, it really makes you learn it. Every lecturer knows that. And we have a crisis on our hands. As I said before, we just can't meet the demand. With more than 80% of South Australia's population living in Kaurna country, the potential is huge. And this is the real challenge: how to meet the demand for teachers, how to make the Kaurna language movement sustainable. This is the topic of an ARC grant that I was lucky enough to win this year, and something that I'll be putting a lot of effort into over the next 3 years. Pirri-Wirrkinthi and Pirri-Wirrkinthi. When I was writing my PhD back in the 1990s, I would often get requests for Kaurna names and for Kaurna translations and for information about Kaurna language. I always felt very uncomfortable as a non-Kaurna person, non-Aboriginal person, giving advice, answering those requests. I often discussed these requests with Kaurna and with Adelaide and various others. I would often give the advice and tell people, look, I'm not a Kaurna person, you really should talk with a Kaurna elder and get their permission. I was never sure whether they followed it up or not, and a lot of the time I guess they didn't. So I always felt very, very uncomfortable about that. So in 2002, together with Kaurna Lewis and Adelaide here, we formed Pirri-Wirrkinthi, creating Kaurna language. At the end of some workshops of the same name, we were actually developing words and expressions that parents and caregivers could use with their babies and young children. That's where the name Pirri-Wirrkinthi, creating Kaurna language, came from. Anyway, it stuck for our language committee. And for years we met every month to deal with requests. Often we'd get 5 requests come through this month, 10 that month, 15 that month, sometimes more than 15. The workload was just huge. KWP worked to promote the Kaurna language and to provide direction for Kaurna language projects. We signed an MOU with UniSA in 2013, and then with University of Adelaide in 2003 with UniSA, 10 years later, 2013 with the University of Adelaide. And the former Vice-Chancellor, Warren Bempington, here with Kaurna and Adelaide. Well, in 2013, we formed Pirri-Wirrkinthi, KWK, as a corporated body through the Office of Registrations of Indigenous Corporations in 2013. And that has taken over the role of dealing with Kaurna requests. KWP, on the other hand, focuses on research and producing Kaurna language resources here at the uni. Here's a team photo from our heyday back in 2012. Taylor, Tipple Power-Smith, is still with us, and Paul's still with us. And we've got Jalen Newchurch and Bianca Sampson Campbell working with us as well. And Place Names Research with Chester Schultz, and supports a lot of lexicography work as well. Here's a few selected projects we've been involved in. I haven't got time to talk to all those, I'm sorry. Well, where do we go to from here? How am I going for time, Richard? Good, okay. Where to from here? Well, I can't stress enough, training, training, training. Training not only provides the knowledge and skills. Now, anyone who works in this area has to learn Kaurna. Apart from maybe Jack's kids, you know, in the 10 years in the future. But for now, everyone has to learn it as an adult. And that's hard going. But the training is not only about knowledge and skills. When you get people together working in this area, it serves to motivate. I've seen this again and again and again. Those professional development sessions we had, Greg, within the education department back in the 90s. which doesn't happen at the moment, did wonders for people's self-esteem and motivation as language teachers. And they would get ideas from other teachers. Kaylin McMillan, wonderful teacher of Adnyamatna, was quite willing to share her resources and her experience. Well, we need recognition of the TAFE Cert 3, Learning an Endangered Aboriginal Language, and the TAFE Cert 4, Teaching an Endangered Aboriginal Language. And as yet, the Education Department for Education, now they keep changing their name, haven't recognised the TAFE Cert 3 and Cert 4. I tell them, well, if it's not sufficient, tell us what else we need, and we'll do something about it. But at the moment, any Aboriginal person who teaches a language in schools gets paid as hourly paid. They get no holiday pay, no superannuation. Work conditions are shocking. And if they're worth their salt, they'll get offered an SSO position, one with much better working conditions, higher pay, and they leave the language teaching area, even though it's a much harder job. So we need to establish career paths with proper remuneration and proper conditions. Now, in terms of recruiting language teachers, it's my proposal, and I've stated this for many years now, that it would be a good idea to provide some introductory language awareness professional development sessions for all ACEOs, for all Aboriginal community and education officers working in schools. And for those working in schools in Adelaide and in the Adelaide Plains, of course, that means Kaurna. If you're down at Murray Bridge, that means Ngarrindjeri. Now, a bit of this knowledge about local place names, about welcomes and acknowledgements, body parts, about artefacts, about fauna and flora, is going to be really useful, in fact essential, for their current role as an ACEO. But that little bit of exposure might stir interest in languages and language teaching, as it did with Jack Gunya-Buckskin. And from there, we might be able to recruit some language teachers. That's what we've really got to think seriously about at the moment. And we better keep continuing to produce Kaurna language resources. Well, why bother? Why bother with a language that we have no sound recordings for? We've got to delve out of the archives. Well, for Kaurna people, unlike Hittite, Kaurna language is important as an act of identity. It's their language. And Kaurna Lewis often tells me, I often hear you say, you've been told you're an extincted people, and yet you're still here. And so the language is an act of identity. And it has a more visceral impact than just saying in English, we're still here, if you can speak your own language. I've seen again and again that engagement with one's own language can turn some people's lives around. It's important for health and well-being, something which Gillard is working with the Bungala people over in Port Lincoln, Whyalla at the moment. Greg Anderson, a Wiradjuri man from New South Wales, has written about this himself, the transformative effect that learning Wiradjuri and teaching Wiradjuri had on his own life. It provides culturally affirming employment. And with the number of schools in Kaurna country, that can be absolutely huge if people only have the knowledge and skills to do it. How are we going, Richard? A few minutes? 2 minutes? Okay. But for all of us, Kaurna is an intricate and beautiful language in its own right. It has its own genius. It's the key to understanding the place in which we live. Now, for everyone who lives in Adelaide, who's lived through a summer, you know that weather phenomenon. November, when that hot northwest wind blows, often preceding a storm. Well, that's known as bukara. If we want to try and explain that in English, to someone who doesn't know it for themselves, we've got to use a whole paragraph to get someone's head around it. We don't have a word for it in English, but Kaurna does, and it has many other words like that. Pirri-Wirrkinthi, the River Torrens, the Red Gum Forest River, in Kaurna cosmology, is a reflection of Wadley-Pirri, the Milky Way. Now, Wadley-Pirri, Wadley, house or home, Pirri, river. Why would you call the Milky Way house river? Well, if you look at the Milky Way, it's the bright stars which are on the edge, and in the middle it's relatively dark, Magellanic clouds. And so it's those dark patches in the middle, which are the Yurikawi, the rainbow serpent hole where the rainbow serpent lives, and the bright stars on the edge are the campfires of the people camping along the bank of the river. So these two entities are in symmetry. They're reflections of each other. Kaurna language, or some language like it, is clearly the source of the Nunga English word deadly. Now, if you're familiar with Nunga English, deadly means something like terrific, super, really good. And in the Kaurna language, Baicha does mean literally deadly, venomous, deadly brown snake. But it also means terrific. It also means something really good. We know from those records way back then that that was the case. Kaurna provides insights into early contact history. We saw that with Kuya, the word for smallpox. So we're all enriched by engaging with languages like Kaurna. In the latest ERA Impact and Engagement Assessment, and this hasn't been published on the ARC website because of perceived cultural sensitivity, but the ARC has been approached to put this up on the web, and they won't because they're in caretaker mode until after the election. Anyway, so I'll show it to you now. And the Kaurna Impact Study was very, very highly commended, both for the Language, Communication and Culture, FOR 20, and for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research. Now, Kaurna language, got 2 minutes more over? 1 minute more? Has led to a whole lot of discoveries in Germany. We've got these wonderful, page from Tandanya's copybook. Yawanalicha Tundari Mangaringa, always worship Jehovah. Ngadluku Pingalingalapa, he is our creator, and so on. Sent by Closet to Germany in 1840 as an example of the work the kids were doing here. This was less than a year after she began to learn to read and write. We have these 2 letters written by 12 or 13-year-old boys sent to Germany in 1843. Thanks very much for sending us those toys. Could you please send us some more? Those German hymns that we were talking about before. Now, if you go to the Lutheran mission in Leipzig, down in the basement, they have a bit of a museum. They have a lot of school groups come through there. And you can see the Wall of Honour, several walls, in fact, where all these missionaries who were sent to Tanzania and India and Papua New Guinea are celebrated. Tuckerman, Sherman, Klose, Meyer were not there. Why weren't they there? Because they were failures. They never had a convert. Well, because of our visit in 2011, Arpad Alicha came over, Werner Kumatri, Karl Telfer. They've been rehabilitated. In fact, Sherman's here, Tuckerman's here. But before 2011, they were just blank spots in the wall. Those missionaries sent 4 Kaurna artefacts over to Germany. These are in Dresden Museum, a spear, a couple of quite different clubs, and a game net used for catching emus. They also sent 300 or 400 bird specimens over to Germany. This little fellow here is an emu wren, very rare in the Adelaide Plains now, a few down in Cox's Scrub. What's wrong with him? Well, he's a wren. He should have the tail sticking up, not down. They were sent skins. They had no photographs to work from. They had no Google. They didn't know how to reassemble them. So sadly, his tail's sticking down. Some of them are too fat, some of them are too skinny. I was wandering around the museum in Waldenburg and came across this fellow, a quoll. And sure enough, when I made some inquiries, they dug out some correspondence to prove the provenance of this fellow, and he was collected by Teichelman in 1840. And so I better end there. I imagine I'm over time. Yaita Warna Putadlu, let's celebrate Indigenous languages. Warabanagana, let Ghana be spoken. Ngaichalya. Ngatati, any questions?
Thanks, Rob. That was fantastic. I know you outlined some challenges forward, but there's probably nothing more satisfying than proving your old professor wrong. It's funny, there's something in the new university strategic plan, and I think it talks about, the university not just being a commentator in society, but being actively engaged. And I can't think of a better example than what we've just had. Anyway, now is the chance for questions. I'm sure you have some. There are a couple of roving mics. Well, I might be holding one of the roving mics, am I? So there's one roving mic. And I'll just look if anyone would like to ask Rob any questions.
Maybe Kaurna would like to come up as well, maybe?
Would you like to?
You want to leave the questions to me, or would you?
No, you do the question.
There we are. Good try, Rob. Do we have any questions? I think the microphone's running the other way, so yes, please.
Can you confirm if the word platypus is from Kaurna language? I've been told it means proud lips.
No word for platypus was ever recorded. We do use kawilta, have used kawilta, kawi being water, pilta being a brush-tailed possum. So a water possum. I don't know whether that's the best way to go or not, but we didn't have a word ever recorded.
Thanks for your interesting talk. A number of years ago, I reviewed your excellent book, Kaurna, and I'm wondering if it's still available, because in your great modesty, you didn't seem to mention it in your references.
Right. Well, that Warabanagana was always a very expensive hard-covered book published in Holland. After many years, I got the rights to republish it. It was republished with some updating of spelling and an additional chapter added to summarise what happened since by University of Adelaide Press, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, but the book does. And it's available for free download. If you get an email from me, you usually get the link in my footer. If you want it printed, print on demand, it's $55 for the paperback. Certainly available.
I have a question. It may be just because I'm not a native English speaker, so I may be misunderstanding the sound. But if I'm not, why is the word Kaurna with K, but you say it with G as a sound of a G?
I could go into a long explanation here because Ghana isn't a Ghana word. But anyway, the KG phenomenon, there's no distinction in these languages between voiced and unvoiced. No distinction between P and B, T and D, K and G. As in Pidindara. Pidindara uses PTK, Ghana uses PTK, Narunga uses BDG, Bangala uses BDG, but really they're pretty much one and the same sound. If you got on the phone and spoke to a Pidindara person and said palya, the word for good, P-A-L-Y-A, they'd understand you, but they'd certainly know you weren't Anango. You were a white fella.
Thanks for a very good speech. Was there any overlap in the meaning and languages of the Merimayana or the Pirri-Wirrkinthi and the Kaurna? Let's say, did they have similar words?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about the Pirri-Wirrkinthi. They were known as the Marimiyana, the eastern people, the eastern men in the Kaurna language. The word Pirri-Wirrkinthi itself, it's got that unk ending. It's a word used by Ngarrindjeri people for the people of Mount Barker, of that region. My guess is that Pirri-Wirrkinthi and Kaurna were very, very similar. When Governor Gray was ordering grammars to be written, he didn't order a grammar of the Mount Barker language. He ordered a grammar of Ngayawang, the Murray River language, because it was quite different. And, well, either they were, well, they would have been multilingual, and either they kept their language to themselves and hid it, or it's similar enough that Gray didn't warrant a separate grammar and vocabulary being written.
I was just wondering, how many seasons do we have here?
How many?
How many seasons do we have here?
Seasons?
Yeah.
I'd go for 4. It's quite different in various other parts of Australia. There's also other terms like Wadlawangati, when the branches fall in the autumn, late autumn, when you start collecting branches to build shelters and whatever. You may possibly regard that as a season in itself, but my hunch would be to go for the 4, aligning roughly with European seasons. After all, we're in a Mediterranean climate here. We're not in the tropics.
Yeah, I agree with Rob. We got 4, and if you want to look at the seasons, we've got a calendar on the Bureau of Meteorology side. You can look it up there.
Thanks very much. I think we need to call a close. We were running late thanks to the filming. That was just a privilege to be part of. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. So please join me in thanking both Rob and Uncle Lewis. And just a couple of announcements. Feel free to keep on walking out. That's absolutely fine. We will be back on the 11th of June with a lecture entitled Positive Charge. And you're going to hear 3 university experts in energy talking about how we'll power Australia in the future. So perhaps I'll see some of you there. If you'd like anything about the university's Reconciliation Week activities, please do look at our website. And thanks for coming and have a lovely evening.